the main scope of this guide? What's the main objective of this guide?
Es una
We
guía
must
que nos da
clarify that
herramientas,
this isn't a policy performing and conducting remote assessments. It gives advice so as to carry out remote evaluations for the quality management system. So this is basically a support
una,
guide in order to carry out an evaluation.
el alcance de la guía aplica para
Now,
todas
what's the scope
el sistema de gestión de calidad.
of this guide? Well, it applies to the whole management, quality management system, that is, so as to carry out the peer reviews, the internal audits in a remote manner.
Presentaciones dentro del QSTF, sino más bien las auditorías internas
So this and internal audits for 2020. And this is so that within our laboratories, we can comply with our objectives or fulfill our objectives, basically. So now, what is the recommendations or what are the recommendations within this guide? First of all, we have the stage, or three stages: preparation for assessment. And the second stage,
y una
during the assessment, we include all aspects which need to be evaluated. And the third stage, the aspects that need to be taken into account after the assessment. So this is quite a short guide, which includes 7 pages and 2 annexes, which we're going to be analyzing further on. Now, the main objective is to verify that the institutes have the resources and capabilities to participate in remote assessment. So these resources have to be identified, and the institute should consider the risks and opportunities of the remote assessment in comparison to an on-site assessment. Because I'd say that this is the most important challenge we have when we implement this guide. And we have to consider this during the preparation stage as well. And we have to take into account documents and other records which have been made available from the digital point of view. Many of us had made progress from the digital point of view. And we had also worked on QSCF as well. And this is an aspect which has to be taken into consideration. Now, we also have to take into consideration that all information and documents have to be available for the reviewers and evaluators at least 2 weeks before the evaluation itself. This is so that the evaluator can review all records, all documentation available digitally, and if anything else were to be needed, it must be made available with enough time in advance. A fourth aspect which has to be considered is that we have to check that the rules for information, confidentiality, and the cyber protection policies of the assessed institutes have to be considered. This is for remote assessments because many of the tools will be videos or photographs. And in these videos or photographs, the client being assessed, well, has to be sure that we're managing confidentiality or taking into account this aspect. So it's important that we're planning or preparing the evaluation considering these 4 basic aspects which are considered in the policy or guidance. And these are, in summary, the most relevant features or characteristics that we must not forget about when carrying out or when preparing in order to carry out the evaluation. Now, Other considerations before the assessment and when planning. When carrying out an evaluation remotely, those of us who have done this might understand that it might be tiring to be sitting in front of a computer for a long time, and it's stressful to carry out evaluations as well. So we do have to set times for the interviews. We have to set uh, breaks, and we have to avoid making this a stressful situation. Another consideration, well, is that working remotely, I mean, a lot of us are working remotely from home. So we must avoid certain aspects, such as, well, sending staff to the laboratory when this is not necessary. So if the policies say that the employee must work from home due to safety reasons, then we must take into account those considerations so that the evaluations are carried out in that manner. So we must avoid taking personnel to the laboratory because we might incur in health risks, which could put the laboratory and the personnel at risk. We must also consider that there are many records which are generally reviewed on site. That's when we're carrying out on site reviews. So, this is something that can make the process slower. And we must take into account that we should review as many records as possible in a digital manner. So there's always going to be a gap between the physical records and the digital records, but there are certain tools which must be taken into account so as to be able to review them all. Well, we then move on to a second stage, which is the stage when we're carrying out the evaluation. And there are three aspects which are considered relevant here. We must respect the schedules, so we must be sure to have time each day for the reviewers to meet with each other to debrief regarding their progress and their observations. So this is because many of us have certain activities which are being carried out within the workday. So many times when we're carrying out an evaluation, and this is based on my experience with on-site evaluations and remote evaluations, we spend a lot of time with one sole evaluator. So, for example, we go here, we go there, we review records, we check equipment. But when we do this digitally, it's all different. So it's important to review what we're doing and also to take into account break time. And this is to manage the evaluation or the assessment in a better manner. And we must also coordinate with all the evaluators who are carrying out this aspect specifically. So if it's just one person, well, this person must also take into account the review of the records and take into account schedules. And if it's a whole team that's carrying out the evaluation, it's very important to exchange information and to also set times so that all colleagues can exchange information, specifically when colleagues are interviewing personnel and speaking to other people, and to avoid repeating the interviews. For example, to have several people interview one same person. So it's extremely important to think about this aspect. And that would be in regards to coordination. Now, the third part in this area, which is important, is to Well, stay calm, avoid interruptions, avoid loud noises. Also, well, we know that we're working in different areas and people are working from home, so we have to try to avoid interruptions. So today, for example, I'm working from the laboratory and they're carrying out some work on the building, some structural work, and I had to move to a different room from where I would normally work. So these are things that can affect our daily work. So now, when we carry out the evaluation, we have to try and do it from the most adequate location. Now, after the assessment, this is the last stage. It is important to consider this with the report that we'd carry out. So it's important to include in the report the risks and
remote,
opportunities associated with a remote assessment.
oportunidad.
So, what we were able to overcome, which opportunities we must take advantage of, because this is something that's going to help all the NMIs and others to carry out the evaluation in a better manner. To provide a description of the performed activities, this is something that must be mentioned in the peer review report. So, what it is that we carried out, how many people we interviewed, and include the work schedule. So, this is all important, and it's recommended that we determine how those assessments that we carried out were performed and what the methodology used was as well. Now, something that's also important to include is those activities or processes that could not be assessed remotely. And our colleagues, Fernando and Isabelle, are also going to talk a little bit about their experiences within remote evaluations. Now, in my case, there was a situation where the video didn't work and we weren't able to move from one place to another. So we did have to include within the report that process or that activity we were carried out was not able to be assessed due to the processes and which should be evaluated afterwards because there's also limited time in order to carry this out. But it's also important to include the fact that a certain process was not evaluated due to those reasons. And lastly, uh, it's important to deliver the assessment report in the terms and within the deadlines agreed with the assessed and the assessment team so that there are no important differences when establishing this report and based on the recommendations in the preparation stage. So with this, we're going to be able to have a better structured and more clear report, which could be understood by all of the employees in the laboratory or in the institute, and that way generate more reports in the future for these various stages. Now, the guide has two annexes, as I was saying at the beginning. The first annex is an example of a checklist for remote assessment. Now, what we tried to do here with the rest of the group was to include these stages, which I've mentioned here with certain questions so that at the end of the evaluation, including all stages. So we can establish whether we've complied with points one, two, etc. And we can say, okay, we've done this, we've done that, we've complied with certain aspects. We have complied with the schedule. Interviews have been considered with, okay, the interviews are going to be carried out within a maximum of 2 hours, which records, documents have been identified, which personnel has been interviewed and assessed. Now, findings have been described according to this and that. And this is well, like a reminder of the fact that we have to assess certain aspects and we have to be prepared according to certain aspects. So that's the idea of this annex, which can be found in the guide. And with this, we're going to be able to better prepare our assessment. There's a second annex, which is well, short risk analysis, where we're going to see which our possible associated risks are and what the likelihood of these risks occurring are through the assessment and generate a report after the evaluation based on the risks which were considered and the opportunities we were able to identify um, through the evaluation. So now we have this guide. And for those who are members of the QSCF, we can find this guide in the document repository. And that's under SimQSTF in the procedure review part. So this is where we're going to find the guide in order to carry out remote evaluations, and you can download it in PDF format. Now, for those who don't have access, in order to be able to review this uh, here, you can find it in the SIM web page. Here in the home page, we're actually under About SIM, and you can find it under guidance document. So you can download it here, and it's a very easy way of doing it. So it's very helpful for analyzing the aspects I've spoken to you about, and it doesn't take long. And these, well, you can ask colleagues about their experiences as well. And I wanted to talk about this because I wanted to talk also about why we've done this and how we've used this guide because it's a very concise guide about what's needed. So in addition to that, I wanted to thank the working group, for example, Ruben, Silvio, Saida, Isabelle, because I am very happy with working with this group because it's a group made up with people from all over the place, men, women, and different regions. And this was very helpful to developing a very positive document. We were able to use your different perspectives and experiences throughout the years with carrying out the assessments and developing guides. And this has led to developing a document, which in my opinion is a very good and simple document, very easy to use, which gives us a step-by-step guide on what to do. Obviously, it can be improved because everything can be improved, but it's a very good start and it's a very good guidance. And I would also like to thank the members of the QSTF who worked together to achieve the approval of this document. And I think it has been very helpful for many of us to carry out our remote assessment and also overcome those obstacles we faced due to the pandemic. So that would be all. This is my contact information. You have my email there in case you have any additional questions. I hope this has been helpful, and I'm here if you need me.
Great, awesome. Thank you, Christopher. So we're going to go ahead and get, I'm going to launch the polling questions that Christopher developed as a part of his portion of the program. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that right now. So everyone should see those questions on their screen. And we just ask you to read through the questions and respond. We'll take about 3-4 minutes to do this. And your feedback is most appreciated. So we also got some questions in the chat. So Christopher, if you can help me answer these. The first one is, well, excuse me, let me go back up and see if there was one question from Guillermo on if there are IT solutions. Let me just read the question. Are there IT solutions included in the guidelines as example of remote solutions applied? Thanks. And so Christopher, do you want to comment on that? Do you want to answer if there are any specific IT solutions or programs that are included in the guidelines?
Okay. Dentro de la guía no se incluye ningún.
So the guide doesn't include, or the guidelines don't include any recommendations on IT solutions or anything similar. And this is going to depend on the capabilities of each of the national institutes in order to develop this. So the evaluator is going to have to play around with the various capabilities they might have available. So they're going to have to basically evaluate the capabilities of each of the institutes as to carry out the evaluation.
Okay, great. And there is another question. It's submitted in Spanish. I don't want to embarrass myself and try to translate the message from Rocio
Rocío
Arvizo.
Arcila, sobre el anexo 2.
This is on the annex on whether the result, I'm sorry, he didn't read the whole question, but I think that what Rocio is saying is, well, she's giving a recommendation on the high result or on the results on the likelihood scale. So Rocio, maybe you could, or actually I would suggest that you send me an email explaining what your suggestion is. So that way we can actually talk about it and discuss it.
Okay, great. I see Rocio's response in the chat. Very good. If anyone else has any questions for Christopher before we conclude this portion of the agenda, please go ahead and submit that in the chat. And I see we're about 40. We have responses from about 42%, slowly increasing here from the attendees through the poll. So I will go ahead and we'll take one more minute before we close the poll and see the results. I'll have Christopher comment on the results, and we can think about that before moving on to the next presenter. I'll just say while we're waiting that the link to the guide was included in or entered into the chat. So if you'd like to read through the guide, you can see the link in the chat or visit the SIM website and visit the QSDF web page. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll now, and we're gonna take a look at the results real quickly here. I'm going to share the results. So, Christopher, if you'll join me in kind of looking these over, what is the main objective of the preparation step for a remote assessment? It looks like the majority of respondents selected the second option.
Yeah, and that was the right answer.
Great. Oh yeah, any comments on that?
No, simplemente me agrada mucho ver.
Well, actually, I'm just happy to see they're clear on what the objective is on, or what the main objective of the preparation step is. That's nice to see.
Very good. Very good. Okay, so the second question. In the preparation stage, which of the following statements should be made? And it looks like we had 90% of the respondents chose the third option, or the verified.
Yeah, it's the right answer. Very good to everyone.
Great. And then last question, during the remote evaluation, which of these factors should be taken into account? And again, the third option was the received 69% of responses.
Yes, and that is the correct answer. So I'm very glad to see the most of the people answer very good. Yeah. So congratulations for everyone.
Very good. Okay, and I think this is a great way to start off the program, because we're going to hear from two other experts in this area to discuss their experience, their specific experiences in conducting these. And so I think this is a great place to start. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the poll results now. And we're going to move on to the next portion of the agenda, which is a talk from Isabelle Amen, who is the lead quality manager at NRC the National Research Council of Canada's Metrology Research Centre. She serves as the NRC's delegate to the QSDF and a member to the Metrology Working Group 12 on Quality Management Systems. Isabelle, are you ready?
I am, yes.
Very good.
So thank you, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you today. I'm going to present you the experience of NRC in actually conducting a peer review in a remote manner. So thank you for being here today. So originally scheduled in April 2020 in person, so the peer review of our QMS in support of our electrical standard calibration and measurement capabilities, CMCs, was cancelled, of course, due to the pandemic. So there was no travel allowed, so we had to cancel all the plans. At the end, it was rescheduled in October 2020 using a remote format. Wanted also to mention to you that the peer review also included the review of new capabilities. So this was new things that we want to add in our scope of approval and in the KCDB for quantum Hall and cryogenic systems. So I'm going to talk about our experience and what we did. I will share some photos, experience, and tips during these presentations. Of course, I did not expect at the time of the peer review that we would do this presentation. So I didn't have a lot of photos taken of the actual peer reviews. So when I'm sharing photos, it would be also from other third-party assessment that we did as part of the accreditation system here in Canada. So I would like to thank in advance also these other parties which allowed me to share this information. So basically, as indicated by Elizabeth, no travel was allowed during the pandemic or at the very beginning of it. And we had a limited number of persons who could go in the lab. And actually at NRC, we could go until September, we could go in the lab only for critical service, for essential services in Canada. So there were a lot of issues that we had to consider to actually being able to perform a peer review. And the question was when and how could we do this with the constraints in place? So how do we come from the picture in the left ear to the picture on the right ear? So I'm going to talk about these four subjects during my presentation: tools, pre-arrangements, the timing, and also talking about the feedback and lessons learned from our experience. In terms of the tools, so those are paramount for success, of course, as explained by previous speaker. Of course, you need available internet access and a certain quality of internet access. And that internet access needs to be accessed at home, because some people would be at home during those reviews. I was at home 100% of the time, as I have been since the March 13 last year. You have to have internet access in the office and in the labs, and you had to take into consideration whether there is Wi-Fi allowed in these labs, or if there were cellular data available in that lab, if was allowed, or if not, then Ethernet access connections had to be considered. So this was the case for our labs. There was no Wi-Fi available. And so we used very long Ethernet cables. So we found the longest Ethernet cables we were able to find with our IT personnel, and make sure all the connections were working in all the labs ahead of time. Some considerations also we had to make is that some of us are living in rural areas where the internet speed sometimes is not great. So we could have considered, it was not the case for that particular review, but for other assessment we did, upgraded connections were needed, or changing of routers to make sure that people who can't be in the office or in the lab, where usually the internet speed is better, so that these people could participate in an acceptable manner. Of course, you need audio and video capabilities. So at NRC, we have the chance that everybody has at least one laptop with those functions. But there is also possibilities of using smartphones, webcams, etc. So we need to make sure everybody would have access to that. Quality of sound, I think, is really one of the most important part of this tool, because we want to make sure people can hear each other, can talk to each other, and exchange during those reviews. The using headsets or earbuds can be very helpful in this, and headsets also can block out background noises. So we have written at NRC some guidelines for either clients or staff for using two of those tools, Zoom or Microsoft Teams. So if any of you is interested to see those guidelines to help people to set properly the quality of sound when using those tools, then I would be very happy to share that through the SIM community. And finally, one of the other tools that you need to think about, and that we actually thought about, is to use a secure data transfer platform for us to share the documentation, but especially records that we would not share ahead of time normally during a normal peer review. That would be, those records would be looked at on site in the labs. They would include, for example, sensitive information about personnel, their training records, or it could be sensitive information about clients as well, that our policy do not allow us to share that freely over the internet. So that secure data transfer platform, we were very happy to have such a platform at NRC. So the pre-arrangements are, I think, the most important part of setting up a peer review. And if there is something you take from this presentation, is really this part. So we did, as mentioned in the guideline that SIM had written, we did a risk assessment. And of course, we had to consider all those things. We say, are people in the lab? Do they have access to the documents and records? Is there internet access in the labs? Of course, we had to take health and safety requirements into account, IT limitations and policies, and also the scope of the review and whether we would add new capabilities or not as part of this peer review. We also discussed the experience of the peer reviewer and how the reviewer was comfortable in being able to do an acceptable review using these means. So we discussed also with them what they would need and what was important for them to see ahead of time. One thing that we didn't have to take into account in our case, but that you would probably have to take into account, is whether there is a language barrier between the staff who are going to be peer reviewed and the reviewer. Do you need translators that would translate live, as we are doing today during this webinar, or would you need to have a staff also available that would translate after the staff has spoken during the review. So this is things that you need to think about. And I think the questions that are in the guideline document that Sim wrote, which has like 13 different questions, are very helpful for you to help you thinking about all of these requirements. So at NRC, we have a special COVID operational procedures that we have to apply. And there is, since September 2020, there are a number of requirements in terms of number of staff that can be on site at a certain time. So it's not more than 30% of the people can be in the lab at the same time, but in an entire building. So for the peer review, we were able to have all the different people that were supposed to work in the lab, in their lab at the time of the review, but there were one person per lab. The manager of the lab was, for example, in his office, and he would join the conversation using the digital platform. For our documentation, we also offer to the reviewer, in addition to receive documents and some specific records ahead of time, to request short videos of a specific step they would want to see, or maybe high resolution photos of an equipment or sketch of an equipment, everything that would be needed for them to have all the information they needed. Of course, we need to set the access to this secure data transfer platform that we used before the review, of course, to share those documents, but also all along the review. As long as the reviewer says, I would like to see this, then we would upload immediately on that site and they would be able to access it immediately. It's a site that's using a two-factor identification process. And of course, when we set ahead of time in the pre-arrangement, it was very important to make sure that the reviewers had access, were able to access these platforms from the IT provided by their own organization. So we had two peer reviewers, one from the USA and one from the UK at NPL. So we need to make sure that the persons were able to access those tools using the IT of their own institutes. Detailed schedule, this is very important, even more detailed than we used to do for a normal in-person peer review. Everyone needs to know where to be and when to be. So we make sure we developed a very detailed one. And finally, the most important thing before the peer review was to run tests or do test runs with all the audio video platforms. And we did that with everyone for everything. So it means audio, video, screen sharing, and other features that we would be using, including the secure data transfer platform. So we did that ahead of time from the labs where the people would be and from where the peer reviewer would be during the peer review. So we took the time to do like 15 minutes test with each and individual to make sure that during the review, there will be no issues. Make sure that you have your IT personnel available during those test runs so that they could be ready to troubleshoot for you and help you with anything at any time. And one thing that is very important is to make sure the organizer must have some experience with the platform you're going to use. So I was the organizer, so I had experience with the one we used for that time was Zoom, but we also used other platforms for other assessments. So it's important that the organizer is not discovering the tool during the peer review, that this organizer has some kind of knowledge to it, plays with it ahead of time and knows what are the issues or how to use and guide the people during the review as it goes. One thing that is very helpful is to have a telephone call-in option. Internet can drop out at any time during a review, from home, from the labs, anywhere. And even though it did not happen during that specific peer review, it happened with other third-party assessment where the person interviewed could call in using a regular phone so that we could continue the interview with that person with the specific questions that we had. And then another colleague was able to share the documents through the internet platform. Regarding the timing and schedule, the first thing that we thought about is what is the amount of time we need? Are we going to have parallel sessions? We had 2 reviewers or not? Are we going to have like first one part of the review being done and then we would continue with the others? We opted for having parallel sessions because we had access to at least 2 Zoom licenses, or even Zoom has the option to have breakout rooms as well. So we decided to do so. Of course, we had to consider time zones consideration, 5 hours difference with our colleague in the UK. We had to consider that, and opening hours for our labs, and also a reasonable time for the reviewers to work every day. There is a demonstrated evidence more and more that Zoom fatigue is something that exists. And of course, you can't stay for 8 hours in a setting like this one to perform assessments all the time. So it's important that you to consider that as well. So the amount of time needed for remote, you have to do that over multiple days. And there's always going to be some documents that will be harder to access, and Zoom fatigue, etc. So for our case, originally scheduled for a week in person, that would have been the normal time we would have taken for that review. It was done over 2 weeks. There were 3 days on week 1 and 4 days on the week 2. It was not 8 hours per day. It was about 4 hours and a half or 5 hours each day. So we developed a very detailed schedule, making sure people knew where to be, when to be, and who had to be where. So the where was the NRC lab number, the room number where each person should be, and on which platform they had to connect. So we had 2 different Zoom licenses and 2 different Zoom rooms, so they needed to know on which one they had to connect at that time. So that the scheduling is, in conclusion, add additional days to take into consideration all these considerations. For performing the review, so we did set up appointments in our Outlook emails to make sure the appropriate links for all the required attendees were accessible, and so that people could connect at time. During the review, take the time, especially there is always something that is not easily shareable. There's no internet on the specific lab computer that we want to show to the reviewer, in which case we would have to maybe put a camera in front of the screen to actually show to the reviewer what we are seeing on the screen. So we did that during the peer review, and actually our staff was, in addition to the camera, the staff was describing what they were seeing on the software running at that time. There will also be some paper records that will need to be scanned or things like that. It's even though it's possible to show in front of the camera, it's not the ideal. So as in regular audits as well, it's perfectly acceptable that sometimes some records are not immediately accessible, but could be sent, later on in the day through email or through our secure platform as well. Another thing, use the technology. We were able to, each user or each person participating in the peer review can join the session, the online session, using several computers at one time, and as needed to share record, or show a software running, etc. And there are nice features in those tools in Zoom or MS Team called the whiteboard, where you can draw things if it's easier to share ideas instead of just speaking. And or you cannot show, then maybe you can draw on a whiteboard. We did that a lot during the NRC review, because many computers that we use, they're connected to internet, but they don't have a camera or a microphone. So the laptop was used mainly as the communication tool, but then with the other session, the staff was able to share their actual work computer screen. And of course, frequent check-ins, daily debriefs. We did that every morning. This was very helpful to have everybody in the virtual room, explaining what was done the day before, the areas of concern, the additional information needed, but also to prepare for the upcoming day. A lot of time offs, at least 30 minutes of breaks. People tend to go directly to their emails instead of actually taking an actual break. So make sure there's enough time so that people can actually walk, take a coffee and take some fresh air, but also check their email if they need in the meantime. Time for reviewers to prepare the report. And also what we did also is making sure the draft report was sent ahead of time of the closing meeting to help the discussion and it's a practice we've done already in the past for actual in-person peer reviews as well. So this is a screenshot, an example, so not from our electrical standard peer review because I didn't take picture at that time, but this is like the screen that I saw during an assessment of a third-party lab recently here in Canada. We were using MS Team, as you can see in this picture, and we were able to see very clearly the experiment on one screen, and there was also possibilities to switch also or to see at the same time the software running that equipment. And using the MS Team, we were also using the whiteboard that we could share, ideas, not ideas, but questions, and maybe explaining better what was the question we were asking to the assessed organization. So using those tools really was very, and of course we had video and audio to speak to the actual people in the lab. So this is to show you that there is possibility to see a software running, to share information or share or converse with the reviewers and the reviewee using those tools. So that's really things that are great things in the technology that can be used. Regarding our peer reviews, I wanted to share with you the feedback we got from our two reviewers. They both provided their feedback. So I will read the first one. The virtual tours of the lab were presented to show equipment in each area. So we did not do live demonstrations of measurements. We had a lot of records, we had key comparisons, etc. But we were able, even though we had long Ethernet cables, to actually tour the lab with our laptop to actually show the lab and the equipment to the reviewer. As an auditor, I believe that the audit was been effective and thorough despite the restrictions. There were no communication difficulties in using Zoom to pose questions, examine example certificates, uncertainty budgets, and documentation. The other reviewer also commented that taken as a whole, I believe the review went quite well. The only real drawback was the observing technical proficiency that was more difficult because of the need to video the technical activities, which was somewhat restricted by the length of the Ethernet cables, the camera placement that we had to correct frequently. So, okay, we can't see that. Can you place the camera better? But and so forth. But this was not a serious impediment to the quality of the review. Finally, I want to talk about the lessons learned and things that we've learned that we could have done better and that we've learned through doing more and more assessments. For the live videos, for sure, do not hold the camera or laptop with your hands. Use a table, use tripods to get stable images. Since the peer review, we have acquired the different webcams with tripods that would help in future peer reviews or internal audits. For the live audio, very important that people speak towards the microphone, especially when the ventilation running in the labs or a ventilation actually from an equipment next to the laptop. Use headsets. I think it improves the audio, especially for the person who is listening. And also, of course, be patient and people always forget to unmute, or you can't hear them very well because they're turning their head from the actual microphone. Try to use headsets that have a microphone that is attached to it, but it's not a mandatory feature. Different tools require more IT resources. So this is something you need to know. We tested, I tested personally at least 3 of those. I used MS Team, I used Zoom, and I used WebEx. MS Team takes a lot of resources from our computers sometimes. So we had to disconnect from the VPN of our work. However, it's not very useful when you want to share something that is on your shared drive that you only have access in VPN. So when you pick your resource, your platform, consider those things and see what would work best. Of course, according to your IT policy, whether this tool is allowed or not by your organization. But this is something that you need to know. But overall, all these tools were quite comparable in terms of the capabilities they were offering you. Finally, communication is key to the success of the overall process. That's very important that this communication before, during the peer review is maintained, and it worked quite great with our electrical standard peer review. Other things I want to share, videos. If you take videos, short videos of a specific work that you do, they do not need to be very high resolution. They don't need to be HD. A medium resolution is perfectly fine, and you're able to see, the reviewer is able to see enough details. Take into account that there are internet dropouts and time zone. Don't forget about time zones if you have reviewers that are not in the same time zone as you. Finally, I wanted to conclude rapidly about the future, what I think about this and whether this will be something that will continue in some shape or form in the future. With the rapid acceleration of technology trends, there are more and more that we can use, and we should really take and embrace those new technologies. They're shown to be effective, but however, they will not completely replace the in-person or on-site activities, because studies have found and show that relationships and trust are only built in person, really. So I think in future, a combination of both remote and in-person, where circumstances are favorable, will be used. I would like to thank you for your attention, and would like to thank specifically my colleagues at NRC, Philip, my colleague who was in the first photo, Jeff, who worked a lot on this presentation, and the class team, our electrical standard teams, and of course our peer reviewers, and to our client here in Canada who allowed me to share photos from their assessment. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Isabelle. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll, the polling questions that Isabelle put together. You should see that on your screen here now. Isabelle, while we're doing that, while everyone's reading through the polling questions, I'm going to also have you respond to some of the questions that came through the chat. Sure. And so the first, and you talked a little bit about this at the end of your presentation, but we had some questions requesting feedback on how you optimized audio, the sound issues. What did you do there?
So we actually, it really depends on each individual and the computer they have. There are more quality laptops than others, something like that. But so we have written actual guidelines on what to do when you use Zoom and when you use Microsoft Teams. So we have this document that we share with our clients for our accreditation activities, but that we also use with our staff, so that if we see there is an issue when we do the test runs, so okay, then read this and try to maybe adjust the sound level, etc. It's important that people don't put the sound at 100% thing, that 50% is okay. I can't actually give you all the details, but we have written such guidance. So if this is of interest of SIM, we can share within the SIM community those things that could be good tips. So we did that only on 2 platforms. We didn't do that for the WebEx, but this is probably very similar. But we have that available, and if this is something people would need, they would be happy to share that.
Great. And there were a couple questions you mentioned at the end of the presentation as well about the platforms you used: Microsoft Teams, Zoom, any others? So
we used the Cisco WebEx for one of our accreditation lab assessment for calibration lab here in Quebec. It worked good. It was more early in the pandemic, so we didn't use all the fancy tools that we discovered, like whiteboards and breakout rooms, etc. So I think there's more to investigate. It's not a platform that that we use at NRC, so we did not investigate more than that. But if this is your company's policy to use it, I'm pretty sure that these platforms are also okay. But yes, we have at NRC MS Team and Zoom are allowed. So we concentrated on these two platforms.
Okay. And so a question from Maria in INM Columbia: the risk assessment should the risk assessment be done for each peer review internal audit individually, or for the whole internal audit or peer review program?
Well, since the scope of each review of each internal audit could be different, there could be additional capabilities added in a specific lab. There could be labs who have internet access very easily, some less. So I would say you would do it for each of those. To many of those, each of the components, maybe you will have thought about it already in advance in the first one you do. But I think there's always some specifics to a specific lab, etc. So I would think again each time before you do one. Okay, great. And then from Rafe, so we have had the reviewers been to the NRC labs in person anytime in the past? This familiarity certainly helps in envisioning the technical processes. If the reviewers were never physically at NRC, this is a much more challenging review, I would imagine. Your thoughts and opinions? Yeah, so in the case of the NRC peer review that we did, yes, the 2 persons had already been at NRC, but not in a function of being a peer reviewer. They went on a lab tour during a conference, so they went in visiting in the past, but never, having the detailed discussions and looking at all the records and our equipment, etc. That's why it's important, of course, that we ask them how comfortable they felt with the arrangements we were proposing. In the accreditation world, we have had, of course, for this year, we considered it's easier if someone has some knowledge already of the assessed organization. However, we have had a few cases where we brought a new assessor abroad during the remote assessment, and using all these tools at the end, especially videos ahead of time, sharing photos and taking the time to properly discuss and interview and looking at records, actually we managed to do a pretty good job. So this is something you take into account in your risk assessment to see how much you need in advance, how much additional information you should require, etc. But it's, yeah, of course preferable, but I don't think it's a requirement. And it's yeah, you take that into account, and it's perfectly acceptable if someone is not comfortable in doing this at all, if they didn't do a lot of audits before that, they're new in the peer reviewing activity. And the thing that is important is after the assessment, always ask whether the objectives were met, and if they think they were able to see enough to make their conclusion of the assessment.
Yeah, very important. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and, so we have a couple other questions coming in. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll here and then share the results. And if you, Isabelle, we'll work through them and you can kind of comment on them. The first one, what is the most important part in organizing a remote peer review? Looks like the majority of respondents selected the pre-arrangements option.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, so I'm happy that everybody listened to me when I said this is the most important part. And of course, yeah, internet connection is also important, but it's part of the pre-arrangements because we do test runs, we check that the internet is working for everyone, etc. Those, yes, I'm happy. Yeah, take the time to do good pre-arrangements and the review will go very smoothly.
Okay, very good. Number two, if you were a peer reviewer, what is the greater concern you would have in performing it remotely? Number two was the most selected option, the difficulty in communication through internet, language barrier.
Yes, so that's that would be, this is not surprising to me. I'm glad to see that not a lot of people are concerned about their ability to witness live work. Using the technology, you're able, or sharing videos ahead of time, pre-recorded videos will help you doing that. Yes, of course, as I said, you know, there's nothing that would replace like live in-person communication and language barrier. And so this is something you need to work on during your pre-arrangements, making sure that those things will be taken into account. And yes, I'm not surprised. And yes, it's perfectly understandable. And if there is anything that you need in addition that SIM would help you, maybe giving more guidance on how to do that better, then we'll be happy to do that also.
That's a great comment. If you, the last question, and this bit unique to each institute, if you were an institute being peer reviewed, what is the greater challenge you would face to organize such a review? And the most of the respondents selected the availability of technology resources.
Yes, so yeah, so this is an interesting result. I think I was expecting that. And yes, and I think as a SIM region, we should be discussing about whether every institute has this technology available, resources to acquire such technology, such as licenses to use these tools, or translation or anything. And yeah, this is important. Of course, if you have access to that technology, then you're able to do that. So that's important information for SIM to know, and to see whether we can help in any shape or form in this, lending you some resources if needed. In any we have a shared platform to share securely some information, this type of things. So it's good information to have, and I think that the group will look into that if there is anything that SIM can help for that.
Great. Okay. Wonderful. Okay, so I think we're just a tad ahead of schedule. Maybe. Well, let's see here. Let's go ahead and let's move on to the next presentation. And again, I'll just mention if there are questions, excuse me, that we haven't gotten to and that are important to you, you can email the presenters directly. We'll have those email addresses available. Maybe I'll put those in the chat, and we'll keep the discussion going. So our next presenter is Fernando Kornblit. He heads the Department of Quality and Measurements at INTI, Argentina, and is the delegate to the INTI delegate to the QSDF, the Quality System Working Group. So I will go ahead and hand the floor over to Fernando. Fernando, are you ready?
Sí, estoy listo. Gracias.
Yes, I'm ready. Can you see my screen?
Yes, looks good.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Christopher, Isabelle. Excellent presentations. So now it's my turn, and I'm going to talk about our experience as INTI with remote evaluations and remote audits. So I would like to talk about these topics today in a more general context, which is talk about digitized framework, so digitized metrology and digitized quality. So about 2 weeks ago, there was an important event which was organized by the BPM. So we created the SIM, a working group on metrology digitization. So now we're talking about the digitalization, about the quality aspects necessary to support digital metrology. So the INTI has been talking about the need to incorporate this tool, remote audits, that is, for a long time, and the pandemic accelerated the process. However, this process did not begin with the pandemic, and we hope that now that we're incorporating these tools, we can continue working with them after the pandemic. So now, as a result of this, last year we developed an internal document within the integrated management system at the INTI. This is IP 18/2020, which provides certain criteria to take into account when developing or carrying out remote audits and assessments. So now I'm going to be presenting very quickly. I'm not going to go into too many details. And this is something that's going to be very similar to what Christopher spoke about. So in order to develop this procedure, we carried out we actually developed certain drafts, and we worked with an NRC document, and we also shared these drafts with the QSTF. So I think that these documents are all related to each other. So I'm going to talk about briefly about aspects on this document, and I'm also going to mention the fact that it's important to evaluate what the auditors have said. That is the auditors who have carried out remote audits. Last month, we carried out a survey among these auditors, and it's important to share their comments. So why do we need a remote audits at INTI? First of all, we need these as an internal audit uh, tool. So INTI is a large institute. Those dots you see on the map are the calibration laboratories belonging to INTI. So now, some of these laboratories declare their capacities before the MRA, and many others cover regional necessities, which are also covered by the quality system. These laboratories carry out a management system audit, and they are quite far away from each other, which is the reason why we were talking about having some of these audits be carried out remotely. The INTI also audits up to 53 supervised labs. And now this network of supervised labs is called SAC, and the audits they carried out includes the provision of technical assistance. And this is a system which is widely accepted by the industry as a way to disseminate metrological traceability. So these 53 labs are distributed among many locations in the country and cover over or carry out over 200 audits per year. Other possible users of these procedures could be the INTI certification body and also legal audit entities. So we would be carrying out these through external bodies in the SAC network. So, for example, in October, there were over 25 audits carried out, and that's where we carried out the surveys among auditors. So now this is part of the procedure. We have certain criteria here regarding when it's not recommendable to audit remotely. So when the quality management system is not known, when there's a new laboratory being incorporated, or when the last audits have been remote, or that's when the previous audits have been remote, when the measurement systems are too complex, or when many non-conformities have been observed recently or in the recent history. So in these cases, it's recommended to carry out on-site audits, or when there are difficulties to share information, or when the level of risk is not acceptable. So in these cases, it's necessary to carry out a risk analysis so as to decide whether all the future audits are going to be carried out on site or remotely. So this is all decided by the auditor. Or actually not by the auditor, but by the body managing audits within the institution. So when are remote audits advisable? Well, when the laboratory has a good conformity history, when the QMS can be and measurement systems are able to be remotely assessed, when suitable ICTs exist, and auditors and audited parties know how to use them, when the risk levels are acceptable, and also for follow-up audits, this is very useful because it's necessary to review whether the actions, corrective actions, are being effective. Because in these cases, there's a prior knowledge uh, on how the organization works. And when there isn't enough time for a face-to-face audit. So they're used as a complement. So for example, the auditor has a bought a ticket for today at 6 p.m., a plane ticket that is. So they have to leave today at 6:30, so they have to leave the laboratory at 2 p.m. It's 12 p.m. and they have to audit two procedures. So in the past, what we used to do, because sometimes, I mean, planning doesn't go as we'd like it to go. And so, I mean, it sometimes used to happen. So what we used to do in those cases is that we just used to speed up those two procedures and the audit didn't used to go as planned. So what we can do in those cases is for the auditor to have a look at what has to be looked at on site, and document analysis or things that can be looked at digitally, remotely, I mean, can be have a look at the following week during a virtual meeting. That's a possibility. Now, there are three forms or three aspects that can look at within the procedure. So through now there are three things: a viability and risk analysis. These are things that are ordered by the responsible body. This is the area in the institute which is responsible for the audit. That's for internal audit. So the quality management has to have input regarding the laboratory on whether there are specific confidentiality and information security requirements, and on what the connection aspects should be that must be taken into account. And also, background must be evaluated on whether the auditors are the right people to manage communication technology. And having taken all of that into account and having carried out a risk analysis, they must take into account the yearly programming and decide which are going to audits are going to be carried out remotely and which are going to be carried out on site. Now we have Form 2, which is quite obvious, but it's important to mention it. It's a confidentiality form, confidentiality and security form, which is different to a face-to-face commitment. So I think this was mentioned a moment ago. So for example, Zoom meetings, can they be recorded, or does a laboratory prefer not to record it? So all of these things must be included in the confidentiality meeting, which must be filled out. And Form 3, that's the audit plan filled out by the auditor, where it's decided who's going to carry out the audit. So that's the audit plan, as I said. And I think I said yesterday that the audit plan is much more important and it's essential. So now there are many more aspects that we must consider. So now we have a contact person with knowledge on the communications technology, information to be required previously from the laboratory. And I think there are two large differences between a face-to-face audit and a remote audit. One of the differences is as follows. A face-to-face audit typically has procedures which are evaluated prior. However, records are evaluated during the visit. So in a remote audit, the more things that can be evaluated prior, the better in order to make the Zoom or Teams meetings shorter. So we have to evaluate all records. That's all records that can be sent prior, because all records that can be sent prior should be sent prior. So the laboratory issued 200 calibration certificates. It makes no sense to send all 200. However, if there are 5 people in the laboratory, well, they can send those people CVs so that the evaluator can have a look at them, or the list of, well, uh, document with their calibration certificate. So what's the sampling process? And in the face-to-face audit, the laboratory shows the auditor the electronic file with the 200 certificates, and the auditor says, okay, I want to see this, this, and that. So it could be that what they can do is, okay, before they send the list with the certificates, and they carry out the sample and they say, okay, send me 3, 7, and 28. And those types of things can also be evaluated or taken into account within the audit plan. So they must also take into account whether they're going to be observing other documents, whether they're going to be sent through a streaming platform, or whether they're going to be pre-recorded. Because if things are pre-recorded, for example, they must not be edited. Things must be recorded in one take so that if they make a mistake, they don't, well, redo it, or they don't edit it. So but however, it's better to do things live. A tool that can be useful would be aptitude tests, informal aptitude tests. So for example, if it's complicated to evaluate people's competence level, it could be, we could use certain evaluations with known values to compare it with what the laboratory is measuring. And that would be a direct level of evaluating the personnel's competence. Now, how are files going to be exchanged? Well, there are documents that might be a bit too large to send by email. So maybe we can use OneDrive or something similar, taking into account the right security measures. And another possibility with remote evaluation is that we can use additional experts for the auditing team. So let's say we're going to evaluate a dimensional metrology laboratory, which has quite a large scope, and the auditor knows a lot about the calibration, but doesn't know about other aspects. So when these other aspects are being measured, well, we can obtain experts which know about these additional aspects. So let's say we have an auditor that knows about 17025, but the scope includes 17034. So when analyzing 17034, we call a colleague to analyze 17034. So This is part of being flexible with remote evaluations. Now, the audit plan. So Isabelle mentioned this, and now well, sessions should be last less than 2 hours, have breaks over several days. And the difference between face-to-face audits and remote audits, well, with face-to-face audits, everything has to be done in a few days because the auditor might be traveling for 2 days or for a peer evaluation for 5 days. However, in a remote evaluation, well, time doesn't have to be, or everything doesn't have to be squeezed into a couple of days. Actually, we can have, 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the afternoon, and it can be spread out through several days. And in between meetings, the auditor can focus on something else, and the laboratory can also focus on something else between meetings. So agendas can be more flexible. It's, not everything has to focus on, not everyone and everything has to focus on one thing during a specific period of time. Things can be spread out. Now, survey to auditors. So, in the survey, 9 auditors participated. Some had carried out more than one audit. But what was interesting here is that there were many comments. There were 5 questions, and after each question, the auditor could provide comments. So, I'm going to show some of the most interesting comments, in my opinion, so as not to talk too much. So, this is going to give us a good idea on what people think. I would like to thank Andrea Rodriguez, who helped me process this survey. So, out of the 9 auditors who were interviewed, 7 considered that the objectives were achieved. One thought that the objectives were achieved partially, and one thought that objectives were not achieved. So, some of the comments were virtual audits are not fully reliable and agile, or well, the analysis of information becomes difficult, and now this person believes it's easier to hide nonconformities, and this is a comment which is important to take into account. Another person thought that virtual audits may help in some cases for maintenance aspects, but not for incorporating new scopes. And technical aspects were not 100% assessed. So this is in relation to the first question. Now, the second question, could the full scope be assessed? 6 said yes, 3 said partially. So comments, the virtual modality does not allow us to observe all aspects. And however, in my technical audit, this is another comment, I was able to assess documents related to the scope, but I could not observe the calibration processes. I assume this was due to my low level of experience with these types of audits. And somebody else said I had no problems with my management audit, but maybe I might have some problems with technical issues. Mention up to 3 difficulties detected, up to 3 per auditor. So the main difficulties observed were difficulties to access documents and delays. And several people said they had a connection or audio difficulties. So I think this is all related to what Isabelle mentioned. And some people said that one of the problems was that documents have not been digitalized. So many of them are still on paper. And now some people said that there were problems with, or relationships between auditor and the audited parties are different or aren't the same. When you're working through a computer than when you're working face to face. Lack of practice with technology or with remote platforms. Now, difficulties detected, problems with connections or slow connections when records are open simultaneously, difficulties to access additional information when required by the auditor. People don't know how to upload things to the internet. Or how to show them to the auditor through the platforms. Somebody said they had difficulty opening several documents simultaneously when wanting to compare several documents. So this is not just a problem with remote audits, but with managing computers on the computer. Somebody said that the laboratory was not well organized. Not all the people audited were there when required. Somebody else said that virtual meetings did not replace on-site interviews. And the explanation of findings is harder if we are not face-to-face. So this is on the side of the auditor, and the audited, well, work can be more difficult. Somebody said it's difficult to sit in front of the monitor 7 hours continuously. This person did not read the recommendation on meetings that should be lower or shorter than 2 hours, despite the fact that we made the recommendations. Minor connectivity failures, some records are still on paper. The next question mentioned up to 3 advantages: better use of time, lower costs, more flexibility for scheduling dates, well, a lower amount of work and procedures, a digital sign of audit reports. They promote the QMS digitalization, better understanding of the QMS. So as you can see, there are people who prefer face-to-face audits and there are people who prefer the virtual modality. And I'd say that this is just the way it's going to be, and this is quite subjective as well. But these are things that we must take into account. So a few comments mentioned up to 3 advantages. Well, it is possible to divide the audit in themes, and this allows us to carry out a deeper analysis. So it makes us be able to carry out the audits faster. So it also allows us to incorporate more experts, better use of time. The auditor does not need to travel. Meetings can be organized in several days, no administrative formalities. Not traveling is a great advantage. Significant reduction of time, ideal for labs located far from the auditors, as well as for audits in which many auditors are involved. Previous analysis of documents allows us to reduce the meeting times. I could organize myself better than when audits are held face to face, and I was less tired by the end of it. And now, other comments that you consider relevant. I was able to learn new ways of carrying out my work, and all learning experiences are an opportunity for improving my work. All resources must be available to the auditor: cell phones with data connection, computers, updated software, IT support, etc. The well, prior connection to test Zoom was crucial for working for avoiding major issues, and on-site audits, the auditor's senses are involved. In virtual ones, this is more difficult. So I wanted to share these comments. Now, if remote evaluation, can remote evaluations be valuable for SIM? This is, I think, what we should be asking ourselves. So now for internal audits, I think this can be very useful. It can be useful for large institutes such as the INTI. So I think it's recommended to rotate, for example, carry out audits face-to-face 1 year and carry them out virtually the next year. Well, for example, do it somehow, for example, every other year. And if we rotate them such as this, it might be possible to improve the frequency with which we carry out internal years at a lower, or internal audits at a lower cost. So this could be the way in which we carry out remote audits. Now, the remote modality for peer reviews. So I call them RPR. So in principle, it's not possible to rotate because 5 years is too much time to carry out a face-to-face peer review and then to rotate them and carry them out every other year because then we would be having face-to-face peer reviews every 10 years. However, it's important to consider different options because when the pandemic is over, we can continue thinking about carrying out certain peer reviews remotely. Our region is a very large region. SIM goes from Canada to Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay. They're very large areas involved, and they're very large areas which don't have the resources to pay the evaluators traveling fees. So if we replace certain face-to-face audits for remote audits, that would be positive for our institute. So what do we think about? Now we have certain aspects here to consider. And now remote evaluations are more reliable when we think of certain conditions. So first of all, we must have reliable peer reviews and we must have evidence based on internal audits as well. And I think I can talk about last year's experience when Andrea Rodriguez and myself were asked to carry out a peer review on the management system. This was from INACAL. And I didn't know the INACAL management system in detail. I mean, all I knew was what Edwin has said in his presentation, a presentation he made last year. So now I was wondering, well, was it convenient to do this? And so we realized that in the previous years, there had been three on-site evaluations on the management system carried out by colleagues who, well, did almost what we would have done. It was Elizabeth Ferreira, Silvio Santos, and Gabriela de la Guardia, who was at the Senam at that time. And so now, since we know that they work very well, we'd read the reports of previous peer evaluations, and we knew that these reports were very positive. We felt quite at ease with carrying this out. So this is if we'd known the system before, because in reality, we didn't really know that system, and we had good evidence on internal audits. So with this, we decided to carry out the remote peer evaluation we carried out in October. So another condition would be high degree of digitalization of the QMS. So I think that the institution or the entity must consider the risks associated with the RPR when it's requested. And based on that, a decision must be taken on whether the remote assessment is requested. The reviewer should report her own point of view when the evaluation is accepted and also when carried out with the report. And the QSCF must analyze the situation when the approval is decided on. So if the evaluation is carried out remotely, it is also necessary to carry out a risk analysis, the background, so as to carry out a successful remote evaluation. Now, technical aspects. Well, now, in addition, it's also necessary to consider certain aspects. And so, first of all, there must be the personnel must be competent. So for example, 5 years ago, there was a face-to-face evaluation and it's the same people who are involved. So nobody's retired and been replaced. So when this happens, the working groups in SIM are aware of it. And there's a high level of confidence in the personnel's competence. And this is very helpful to feel at ease when one accepts carrying out a remote peer evaluation. And it's the same thing with the teams in the facilities or the equipment in the facilities. Because, for example, if there's no new equipment and the facilities are the same, this is all very helpful. It's also very helpful if there's no significant changes, if there's no new scopes or no new capabilities involved because, for example, everything is still the same and there are no new changes. And the evaluators have visited the Institute in the past. So these aren't conditions that have to be complied with. These are conditions that if they are complied, they just make us feel more at ease. So I think that from the point of view of the QSCF, they make us feel more comfortable. And there shouldn't be conflictive issues in the measurement system. There's a sentence in the QSCF guide that says it will be hard to assess the appropriate uh, uh, sticking of gauge blocks or the wide angle sight seeking the presence of adverse influences on the laboratory activities unless pre-recorded videos are used and provided to assessors. So, I mean, this is something to take into consideration. And we must also think about all influences in a laboratory. So this can also be complicated when carrying out a remote assessment. So when we decide whether a peer evaluation is going to be carried out remotely, a possibility could be to seek out the opinion of a specific working group so that they can say, okay, for this type of scope, for this measurement system, etc., the remote peer evaluation could work well. But for this other one, maybe not. Maybe it's not that convenient. So an opinion such as this is very important for the Institute, for the evaluator, but specifically for the QSCF when deciding whether the peer evaluator is sufficient or not. Because in the end, the QSCF must analyze the situation when deciding on the approval of the quality system. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you all.
Great, thank you, Fernando. So we're going to quickly launch the poll here, and we've got just a few more minutes remaining in our before we hit 12 o'clock or 1700 hours. So I'll launch that poll. Have everyone respond. We've got quite a few questions for Fernando. One of the questions was
Perdón, una aclaración.
I'm sorry, I wanted to clarify in this poll. There are several right answers. There's not just one right answer. So please take that into consideration.
Yeah, and I want to apologize to Fernando. I may not have formatted the poll correctly. It might only allow for one answer for each question by each respondent. So I apologize for that. So Fernando, we have just a couple more minutes. Let's try to respond to some of these questions. From Javier, mentioned a question about confidential information. Despite confidentiality documents signed, there are some records that cannot be shown in total to the review, but on face, in-person peer reviews, the NMI can show the relevant parts to the reviewer without handling the whole record to the reviewer. How do you manage this issue? Fernando?
Bueno, es una buena pregunta.
That's a good question. Well, if only part of the document cannot be or can be shown, well, what you must avoid is sending the document by email, but you can take a picture of or a photograph of the part that can be sent and send that photograph of that part by email. And you can use Zoom or MS Teams or any other platform without recording, it's also important to avoid recording. So, for example, you're using Zoom without recording, which would be the equivalent of looking at it face to face on site without having the evaluator keeping record of it. And you're also assuming that this is a secure connection, and you also need to make sure that you're not recording, that nobody's recording the session. Does this answer your question, Javier?
So yeah, so there's also in the chat, you'll see a response from Isabelle, similar to on the subject, similar to confidentiality and security. And I think some of her comments are also quite helpful. So I want to apologize. We had some time set aside for questions and answers, but I think as we're nearing the end of the agenda, I'm not sure if we'll be able to do that. I want to give the floor to Elizabeth Ferreira before we close the meeting. If Elizabeth, do you have anything to say?
Yes. Perdón, en español.
Yes, I'll say it in Spanish. First of all, I'm very happy because the objectives when we designed this workshop were achieved. So I would like to congratulate you, Andrew. I would like to congratulate Christopher, Isabelle, and Fernando, because you've managed your times very well. I think that we have managed to exchange information and experiences, which was what we wanted to achieve today. And now I'm very happy with this webinar today. But before we finish, I also wanted to thank a few people, especially people who are outside of the quality management group. So within the organization committee, I would like to thank Andrew for the work he did before and during the workshop, because he, as always, he is very efficient. I would also like to thank Claudia, because with her efforts, we have managed to obtain a translation during the webinar. And she has also, well, managed many things regarding this workshop, such as sending the links, etc. And now I would also like to thank others. I'm sure, I'm sorry, I didn't understand what she said. And I would also like to thank, I think she said Lisa from El Salvador, because they were very, the chair and vice chair of the technical committee, because they were, well, they worked with us with the working group. So thank you everybody else for participating, and we'll see you soon. Thank you, Elizabeth. And Lisa and Claudia were responsible for sharing all of this information, and congratulations to all women for Women's International Day. And Sim is actually a great example of how these spaces have been filled out by great women. And I think that's why we're all so successful today. So congratulations to all of you. I think Javier is applauding, and Andrew and all of my other male colleagues are very happy to be working with you.
Great. Okay, I think with that, we'll conclude the meeting. I'll just mention that this meeting was recorded and will be put on the SIM website for those who weren't able to join us in person and for future reference. So thank you all for joining us. It was a real pleasure. Bye, everyone.
Bye bye, everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you, Lisa.
Bye.
Un
see
gusto
you.
verlos.
Bye, Claudia.
Bye.
Isabel. Bye bye.
Abrazos
Chao,
a todos.
gracias por
Chao.
todo, muy bueno.
Kevin.
Felicidades.
Muy bueno, gracias.
Que estén muy bien todos. Chao.
Gracias, Elizabeth.
Gusto verlos.
Excelente.
Sí, gusto verlos a todos.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Silvio.
Nos vemos, Claudia.